as national servant leaders of the movement of lions and indomitable lions for the Pan-African liberation of Cameroon, I want to take this Monday, the 14th of July, 2025, to share with you our reactions regarding yet another announcement of a so-called candidacy by the dictator Paul Biya for an 8th term as head of Cameroon. An announcement that we naturally became aware of yesterday, the 13th of July, 2025. I would like to begin by gently reminding all Cameroonian men and women that there has never truly been an actual legitimate election in Cameroon from the colonial period right up to this current year, 2025. For the record, in 1945, the first legislative elections in Cameroon were organized under French colonial rule to elect representatives to the French Assembly. It goes without saying that these representatives were chosen by the colonial power, and as a result, it was a pseudo-election, since the colonial power itself never had in any way the right to seize our African lands and appoint representatives for the African peoples. In 1956, the famous Loi Cadre de Fer organized the first local legislative elections, with a relatively greater role given to representatives from the colonized population. The elections of the 10th of April, 1957, which allowed Amadou Ahidjo to become vice president of the government council, were once again organized by the French colonial power, which rigged the electoral process from the outset by placing at the head of the institutions and the colonial administration in Cameroon those Cameroonian men and women who did not want full and effective independence for Cameroon. When, half-heartedly, the French colonial power proclaimed the independence of Cameroon, whether on the 1st of January, 1960, or later in what was then called Anglophone Cameroonites, was clear that all the elections were merely an expression of the will of the colonizer. The Cameroonian people did not freely choose anyone. When Mr. Amadou Ahidjo claimed to have been elected president of the Republic of Cameroon after the so-called elections of the 21st of February, 1960, once again it was a colonial affair, there was no competition, no fair rivalry, and no oversight of the electoral process by an independent authority. Ahidjo was imposed at the head of Cameroon by French colonial brutality. Moreover, it was without difficulty that he established a one-party regime, and the so-called first legislative elections of 1964 were simply a continuation of the same theft begun in 1945 by the French colonial power. The constitutional referendum of 1972 was a scam of the same kind. By dismantling the federal system, Ahidjo in reality seized and centralized the powers of the Cameroonian state under the control of his masters, the French colonizers of the De Gaulle regime, and later of Pompidou. In 1984, the constitutional revision that took place and abolished the position of prime minister cannot hide the fact that since 1961, a certain Paul Biya, chosen by the French colonizers of Cameroon as Ahidjo's designated collaborator, has steadily risen through the ranks of the state apparatus until he became prime minister in 1975. This allowed him, under this constitution written by French hands and for the French auxiliaries in Cameroon, to ascend in 1982 to the position of president of this banana republic. It is well known that Mr. Biya himself, just like the man who handed power over to him, Ahidjo, on orders from France, were never chosen by the Cameroonian people. When, in 1985, he transformed the Cameroonian National Union, Ahidjo's party, into a new party called the RDPC, everyone saw, through the trickery, it was simply the continuation of the country's neo-colonial domination. In the meantime, more than 1 million Cameroonians were massacred between 1945 and 1,971 on the grounds that they are mobilized around the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, demanding the country's true independence. It is important that when you hear about the so-called return to multi-party politics in 1990, you do not forget that Paul Biya successively stole the legislative elections of March 1992 and the presidential elections of October 1992. He had quite naturally lost these at the polls, but it was a defeat he never acknowledged. And since then, the electoral process under Paul Biya's regime has been a series of repetitions, with results decreed by the head of the executive of this rogue republic. The legislative elections of 1997 were rigged. The legislative and municipal elections of 2002 were rigged. The presidential election of 2004 was rigged. The legislative election of 2007 was rigged. The constitutional revision of 2008 was achieved at the cost of the massacre of hundreds of Cameroonians during the hunger riots. The presidential election of 2011 was rigged, in which Paul Biya claimed to have been re-elected for a 7th term in his so-called election. The senatorial election of 2013 was rigged. In any case, Biya appoints all the senators, give or take a few votes. The presidential election of 2018, in which he claims to have received 71% of the votes, was also rigged. In the meantime, the country has plunged into a terrible conflict, especially in its Anglophone region, and the 2020 legislative and municipal elections were rigged. Just as another rigged election, another so-called election, is being prepared for October 2025. It is important to remind Cameroonians that they have never truly experienced a so-called democratic election, a transparent election, an objective election, a clear election. That does not exist in Cameroon. What Cameroon has experienced from 1945 to 2025 is a succession of so-called elections, that is to say, electoral frauds. The regime mobilizes violence, it mobilizes fraud, it mobilizes corruption, it mobilizes lies, it mobilizes cunning. Having seized control of the state apparatus, having seized the security apparatus, having seized the media apparatus, having seized the diplomatic apparatus, the regime has been perpetuating itself since 1945 against the will of the Cameroonian people in Cameroon. So when Mr. Paul Biya, the dictator, announces through the press, including on his Twitter or X page, that he is supposedly a candidate in the so-called presidential election of the 12th of October, 2025, it is information that only holds value for the naive. The information is worthless. For the simple and obvious reason that for several years now, it has been very clear that Mr. Biya, who is now over 93 years old, is being used by his clan to wield power in his name, in his place, and that from time to time, sunk into his status of non-interference, confined by the inevitable limitations of old age, Mr. Biya emerges to perform a few symbolic acts meant to distract the public from the true nature of the power he holds. This power is exercised in the name of Mr. Biya, but Mr. Biya himself has not exercised power for a very long time. He serves as a cover for a criminal oligarchy propped up by French neo-colonialism and Western imperialism, a criminal oligarchy that by using him as a sort of mascot, as a veil, has taken control of the financial administrations of the Cameroonian state, has seized the strategic units of Cameroon's defense and security forces, has taken over key positions in the administrative apparatus, in the government apparatus, has taken control of the main local media, and for a while longer still controls the country's diplomatic system. Mr. Biya is merely a front for the clique around his own wife Chantal, the group around Gongo Ferdinand, the group around Biya Frank, the group around Sadi Rene, the group around Kavayege Dubule, Abu Bakari, the group around Tiroma and Bello Boba Maigari, the group around Niat and Dife, the Marcel, this entire oligarchy that is governmental, military, financial, media-related, diplomatic, and also familial. Clannish, it is this group that actually wields power in Cameroon using the old man as a cover, as a veil. This is the true nature of power in Cameroon. So Paul Biya is not a candidate in the presidential election in October 2025 in Cameroon. Why? Because there is no presidential election in Cameroon. There is a sham. That is why I created the concept of a pseudo-election. Paul Biya is not a candidate in a presidential election in 2025 in Cameroon because Elicam, which is nothing more than the recording office for the whims of the criminal clan of the oligarchy supported by French neocolonialism and Western imperialism that holds Cameroon hostage, the so-called results proclaimed by this recording office have nothing to do with the true will of the Cameroonian people. Paul Biya is not a candidate in an election in Cameroon because in any case, he no longer actually exercises power himself. He is being used. He is an old man who has been captured. He is an old man who is being tortured. He is an old man who is being used by his wife and the operatives of the criminal oligarchy that he himself put in place. They use him to exercise and have been exercising for several years now the reality of power. That is not called a candidacy. We talk about candidacy where there is fair competition. We talk about candidacy where there is an objective count of the electoral rolls. We talk about candidacy where there are impeccable institutions. We talk about candidacy where there is a free, fair, and indisputable process for selecting the nation's representatives. But none of that exists in Cameroon. The electoral rolls do not exist. The Electoral Commission is under the control of the oligarchy I just described. The Constitutional Court is under the control of the oligarchy I just described. The security and defense forces are under the control of the oligarchy I just described. The state coffers are seized by these thieves who use them however they please. The state media are captured in the same way. The country's diplomatic system is currently at the service of this clan of thieves, embezzlers, and killers. You cannot talk about candidacy. You cannot even talk about an election under these conditions. Paul Biya is not a candidate for anything because there is no election, and all those who call themselves candidates under these conditions are mocking themselves and the Cameroonian people. To accept being called a candidate in such conditions is to make a mockery of oneself and of the Cameroonian people. Because for you to be a candidate, there must be electoral lists. For you to be a candidate, there must be an electoral commission. For you to be a candidate, there must be a constitutional court capable of judging the electoral process. For you to be a candidate, there must be media justice. For you to be a candidate, there must not be someone using the army, the gendarmerie, the police, or the intelligence services to terrorize everyone. For you to be a candidate, there must be real political competition. That is why our movement, the indomitable lionesses and lions for the Pan-African liberation of Cameroon, maintains the following positions. The Cameroonian people, from north to south, from east to west, including the center and its diasporas, have a single duty: to continue fighting in order to first remove Paul Biya's regime from power. The popular, peaceful, and civic revolution is the #1 imperative for the Cameroonian people. Paul Biya's regime is an obstacle to holding real elections in Cameroon. As long as this regime remains, there will never be real elections in Cameroon. First, we must remove the enemy of elections, the adversary of elections, the killer of elections, the manipulator of elections, the fraudster of elections. We must first remove him, establish a transition, and reorganize the political, economic, social, and cultural systems of this country in the form of a new kind of Pan-African Federal Republic in which there can truly be real elections. First, we will need to consider a genuine referendum for a new constitution of the new republic during this transition. Elections, real elections, will only take place once the obstacles to elections have been removed. And the RDPC and all the RDPC elites currently in power are the real obstacles to elections in Cameroon. As long as we have not removed them from power, we will never have elections in Cameroon. Cameroonian men and women can go up and down all they want. The fast being prepared for October 12 will not change the real fate of the Cameroonian people, because it is a fast that has been scripted in advance. The results of the so-called election on October 12, 2025 have already been written at the 2D Palace. The distribution of votes has already been decreed by the clan that holds Paul Biya hostage and uses him as a captive old man. They use him as a fig leaf to justify their power. Cameroonian men and women must turn their eyes and hearts away from this masquerade and focus primarily on removing the RDPC from power through widespread popular and civic mobilization. There are countless solutions for holding real elections in Cameroon. First, those who have been rigging, violating, cheating, and stealing for decades must go. You can't have an election when it's a cheater who announces the results. You can't have an election when it's the cheater who decides the percentages. You can't have an election when it's the cheater who creates the electoral list. You can't have an election when it's the cheater who controls the constitutional court. You can't have an election when it's the cheater who controls the state's finances and has turned them into his own personal business. You can't have an election when the cheater uses the police, the gendarmerie, the army, and the intelligence services to intimidate everyone. That cannot be called an election, and no serious person can be a candidate under such conditions. So, Lilipac Martel, the message of Plan B on this Monday, the 14th of July, 2025, is a total peaceful popular revolution involving all the vital forces of the nation, including patriotic forces within all groups, capable of envisioning a Cameroon that transcends parties, ethnicities, and regions. A Pan-African Cameroon only, these forces can save the country. Get out, get out, get out! Out of this electoral mythology. There are no elections in Cameroon. Get out, get out! Get out of this fake parade of candidacies and the candidates, so-called candidates for what? Candidates against whom this 93-year-old man, what? Is there a candidate for? What can he bring to the Cameroonian people that we haven't seen since 1982? It's been 43 years. What is he going to bring to Cameroonians in the next 10 years that we haven't seen in the 43 years that have passed? How can we even dare to call that a candidate when in reality it's simply an individual being used as a tool, a mascot? He is a puppet, the puppet of a clan of embezzlers made up of his wife, Chantal Biya, his son Frank Biya, his daughter Brenda Anastasie Biya, the Secretary General of the Presidency Gongo, Prime Minister Jean Goudet, and all the other government ministers, the President of the National Assembly Cavalier Gwegwigwi Jibril, the President of the Senate Niet Ninjifendi Marcel, and especially his deputy, Lamido Abubakari, the commanders of the headquarters, the commander of the Presidential Guard, the commander of the Rapid Intervention Battalion, and the main heads of military security. These are the thugs who are holding Cameroon hostage and who use this man over 93 years old, as a fig leaf for their scheme. And some even dare to claim that he is a candidate. A candidate for what? Has Biya ever been elected? Even once? Ahidjo reminded him of that. Before he died, Ahidjo reminded Biya that he had transferred power to him in 82 on the orders of François Mitterrand and the French. But it wasn't because Biya had beaten him in an election. Ahidjo himself never beat anyone in an election. No Cameroonian president has ever won an election to become president. They are all people who came to power through colonial violence, corruption, fraud, or constitutional manipulation. Not a single leader, not a single Cameroonian head of state has been legitimately elected since this damn republic has existed. So, my dear friends, indomitable lionesses and lions of the Pan-African liberation of Cameroon, history is proving us right. The Cameroonian people are witnessing, day by day, the emergence of Plan B, which we have spoken about for several years as the only path to salvation for the Cameroonian people. Because this Mr. Biya is being used as a so-called candidate for his own re-election, you are already being implicitly told that the result of this sham election has already been written. The Cameroonian people have nothing to expect from October 12th. October 12th is a non-date. It is a non-event. October 12th means nothing. The Cameroonian people have the immediate duty to reclaim their sovereignty. All Cameroonian women and men have the right to put an end to Paul Biya's regime because it is an illegitimate regime, profoundly unjust, illegal, a criminal regime, an incompetent, ineffective, and diabolical regime. All true resistors, all true opponents of Cameroon will join the Lilipac's Plan B, namely a mobilization of millions of Cameroonians. Just think about it. There are more than 15 million Cameroonians living below the poverty line with less than $2 a day. 15 million Cameroonians, practically. These people cannot continue to hope for anything from this zero-sum, stagnant system, this pitiful, disheartening, disastrous system, this sluggish system, this deadly system. This infernal system cannot leave Cameroonians out of poverty. So instead of focusing on the so-called election of October 12th, we must set our sights on the Tudi Palace, because the Cameroonian people must take it. We must focus on the institutions of the Republic, because the Cameroonian people are the only sovereign. They must take control of their institutions. The people are the sovereign. It is the Cameroonian men and women who must choose the leaders of Cameroon. To do this, they must first remove those who prevent them from doing so. When tyranny is the rule, resistance is a duty. So for our part, we tell Cameroonian men and women not to listen to all the electoral chatter, all the talk from so-called candidates for the so-called October election. It's just talk. It will lead nowhere. It led nowhere in 2018, it led nowhere in 1992, and it has led nowhere since 1945. Study the so-called electoral history of this country, and let us wake up from the dogmatic slumber in which so many insist on remaining. As long as we haven't uprooted the organization that rigs elections, namely the neo-colonial Biya regime, which itself comes from Ahidjo's neo-colonial regime, we will never have leaders chosen by our people. So it's